Marhaban, welcome, and Happy New Year for those I haven't seen yet. Yes, this is 2024, and we are starting the year with our first Science Talk event, and I'm very glad to see a lot of new faces and faces that are coming over and over since we started back in September now. Be aware that we have a very exciting program coming up for this year, and I'm very excited about this talk today, but we will have also a series of very interesting talk coming up. Again, I just want to thank and to mention that this series is done in collaboration with the Environment Agency Abu Dhabi, Emirates Natural History Group Abu Dhabi, the Natural History Museum Abu Dhabi, and Nautica Environmental Associates. And you will see that everybody, or almost everybody, will be represented here tonight. And we will not spend the next hour underwater, maybe with feet in the water, some feet, but we will be talking about birds tonight. And I'm very, very excited about that. And I will happily give the microphone to Claudia Stuber, who is the chair of the Emirates Natural History Group Abu Dhabi, and she will be the best person to introduce our main speaker. But just before we start, remember to keep all your questions for the end. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Here to you, Claudia.
Thank you. So I'm happy to introduce today's speaker, Oscar Campbell, who has been a long-term member of our group and supporter. Oscar Campbell originally is from Ireland, and he has been living in the UAE since 2006. He is a keen natural historian with a particular interest in birds. As a world birder, he travels to many countries to increase his knowledge about the avifauna. He is currently the chairman of the Emirates Bird Record Committee and co-authored Butterflies of the United Arab Emirates, including Northern Oman, Motivate Publishing. His recent work was the third edition of Field Guide to Birds of the Middle East, Bloomsbury, to be published in March 2024. Since February 2023, he is working as an ornithologist in the team of Nautica Environment Associates. And the members of the Natural History Group want to say thank you to Oscar for all the birding field trips that he guided for our group and for sharing his immense knowledge about the birds of the UAE with us. And we are looking forward to his talk, Winged It, an introduction to the UAE's bird life. So.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Can we move the slides? Perfect. Okay, thank you. I'm assuming you can all hear me. Thank you very much to SeaWorld for the opportunity, and thank you for coming along to listen. I'm going to do, I hope, what it says here, and just give you an introduction to some of the fascinating and beautiful birds that we have here in the UAE. I'm just going to start with this picture. For many, not all, but many of the pictures, I've put the names of the birds just there, though I'll probably mention it anyway, but just in case I speak a little bit fast, they're there as well. So I've just started with three pictures here, Indian roller, red-wattled lapwing, and purple sunbird. And I've used this slide before to start talks, and the reason I use it is because I have a question for you, actually, and the question is, well, what do these three birds have in common? And if you look at them, there's a couple of things you could say. They're all quite attractive looking, and that's partly why I chose them. And there's a couple of other things. They are all actually, I've got an Indian distribution. I'll come on to that in a few minutes. That'll be a more technical answer. But the point I'm trying to make here is that you can see all of these spectacular, beautiful birds within about 1 kilometer of where you're standing or sitting right now. Two of them are particularly common. You've definitely seen them before, and even if you haven't noticed them, red-wattled lapwing and purple sunbird. The purple sunbird might even be nested in your garden. Indian roller is a little bit trickier in Abu Dhabi, but it does occur on Abu Dhabi Island and Yas. And if you're used to, if you live in Al-Ain or you visit Al-Ain or Dubai, it's an extremely common bird. So the point here is that the UAE, despite common perceptions a lot of the time, actually has got lots of common and spectacular birds that anybody can see. You don't need to be a specialist to see. They're interesting, but some people maybe find them a little bit less exciting. If you're really hardcore, these are the sorts of things that will really get you excited. And this is why birdwatchers come to the UAE every year to see really interesting species like this. Species which are really difficult to see in some cases almost anywhere else in the world. Hypocoleus on the right there is usually number one in every visiting birdwatcher's sort of target list when they come to the UAE. It just breeds in Kuwait and Iraq and southern Turkmenistan and spends the winter in Arabia. You can actually see that within a kilometre of where we're stood right now as well, or at least in the past you've been able to. It's become a bit erratic in the last few years. Crab plover is actually quite a common bird on intertidal areas. I'll come back to them shortly. In the UAE, it's a classic bird of Arabia. It doesn't breed anywhere else, but again, it's extremely desirable species for visitors here. And then you've got some really obscure stuff like the petrel at the bottom there. That bird only breeds on Socotra Island. Its breeding grounds were actually unknown until about 2002. But it occurs in quite large numbers, actually, off the east coast of the UAE, at least in some years, although you have to go quite far offshore to see them. So the point here is the UAE has got lots of birds, and it's got lots and lots of interesting and exciting birds as well that keep people like me sort of interested and busy, as well as normal people. So what I'm going to do, what I hope to do today in the next sort of 30 minutes or 35 minutes or whatever it is essentially here. I'm just going to give you a few key facts about bird life and birds in the UAE. I'll then talk a little bit more about breeding species and biogeography. I'll explain what I mean by that when I get there. I'll talk a little bit about species of global conservation concern which occur in the UAE. We'll then have a quick tour of, I think it's 7 or 8 different habitats of the UAE and characteristic species that occur in those habitats. We'll talk a little bit about the end, or towards the end, about bird migration, something I'm particularly interested in. And I'll just want to finish off with a few examples of how we're still learning things. There's still plenty to discover with regard to birds in the country. And so just to start with a few key facts, alongside this rather attractive blue-cheeked beater. If I'd been given this talk a month and a half ago, if I'd been given this talk up until October, I would have said to you there's 470 species of birds have been recorded in the UAE, and that immediately surprises quite a lot of people. If I ask people to guess, they sometimes say 30 or 40. But there's actually 470 species on the UAE bird list. Up until early November, we added 2 more. I'll come back to them at the end. 158 of those were actually recorded once on one day. It was quite a long, busy day. On Abu Dhabi Island, there's been approximately 300 species recorded. So that's, and if you think about it, there doesn't seem to be a lot of greenery or doesn't seem to be a lot of natural environments on Abu Dhabi Island, but there's approximately 300 species being recorded. 105 of those on one day. There's one site in the UAE which has recorded nearly 300 species, somewhere on the east coast at Dibba. And I think there's now 25 different sites which have recorded 200 species or more. Of the 470 species or 472 species in the UAE, about 100 of them breed most years. Some of them are quite scarce and probably don't breed every year. There's approximately 100 breeders, so that means the balance, 370 or whatever it is, are coming here on migration, and they're coming here to winter. So there's lots and lots of interesting migration, lots of interesting migrants, and lots of winter visitors in the UAE. The best time for seeing birds and seeing big numbers of birds tends to be sort of from October to about March. Well, it tends to be October or March, when you get a combination of winter visitors still around and migrants coming through. I think we've got 27 species of global conservation concern. I'll explain in due course what I mean exactly by that and give you some examples. But we've also got about 15 species which, although they're not of conservation concern, they're particularly interesting from a visitor's viewpoint. And again, I'll mention them briefly in just a second. Just to start with, or to move on to breeding birds, I think I mentioned we've got about 100 breeding species. 85 of those are native, so 15 of them have escaped from, or been deliberately released, or they've escaped and they've established populations and so on. And just over half of those species I would categorise as pretty widespread. They're fairly easy to see. The other 46% or whatever are actually quite difficult to see. They, for example, they use wetland habitats, which are very, very patchy in the country, or they're just very, very uncommon. There's only one or two pairs in any one year. They're right on the edge of their range, or so on like that. The numbers in the graph, the numbers on the table here actually show the number of breeding species, in black, show the number of breeding species recorded in each of the squares that they represent. And what you can see here is, as you go towards the east, and as you go towards the north, there are more and more, the breeding bird diversity of the country actually increases. And that's actually a pattern that's shown with a lot with plants and with butterflies and things like that as well, with groups that have been well studied. The natural history of the UAE is much richer when you move to the mountains, where there's more diversity of habitat. There's also more rain in the mountains and so on like that. The numbers in red actually are the same figures, but that's data that was collected. That's data that was known about up until 1995. The black figures are what the values were in 2005. The book I took this from was published in 2010. And so what you can see there is, it's relatively recently, we've in the last 30 years, we've actually learned quite a lot about the avifauna of the UAE. Some of the increase that you can see there, in all cases, the black number is bigger than the red number. But some of the increase that you can see is because people have gone out birdwatching and gone out looking, and the better data has been gathered. But also, there's a few species which actually didn't breed in 1995, for example, or originally, but they actually do breed quite commonly. They do breed quite commonly now. The avifauna of the UAE is actually changing all the time, which is exactly what you'd expect in response to habitat changes and so on. And here's 4 real success stories. These are species which are common or very common in the country just now, but 30 years ago, you would have struggled to find them. Or if you'd found them, like hoopoe, for example, it would have been on migration rather than being a breeding bird. But hoopoe's now a common breeder in Dubai and Elaine, and actually in the mountains in the Hajers as well. The cattle egret on the right there is a very local breeder in Dubai and one or two places. It's a common winter visitor. You've probably seen it on roundabouts and verges along some of the main roads in Abu Dhabi. White-eared bulbul is just about the most common bird in the country, but that's actually non-native. It was the population here are wholly introduced about 30 to 40 years ago, but they've spread like crazy ever since. They're now just about the most common bird in the country. I said I would talk briefly about biogeography, so that's what this represents. All I want to show you here is I've taken the 85 breeding species, the native breeding species, and we've looked at, or I've put them into groups depending on where their main distribution is. And there's 5 or 6 big zones of the world that scientists can categorize organisms into with regard to where they come from. I don't think I've explained that very well, but I'm not going to do a better job by trying again, so I'll leave it at that. Essentially, what it means is, for example, if you're a Palearctic species, the Palearctic there is essentially Europe and Russia, Northern Asia. Your main distribution is in that region. If you're an Afrotropical species down at the bottom there, your main distribution is in Africa. What these figures show is that 1 out of the 85 species there is essentially an African species, which also occurs in the UAE. 15%, so whatever that is, 10 or 12 species, are essentially Palearctic species. Their main breeding range is in Central Asia, in some cases Europe, as well as Central Asia, but they also breed in the UAE. A particularly interesting group are the Saharo-Scindian species there. They're essentially species which are adapted to the desert belt, which runs essentially from Senegal or Morocco all the way to northwest India. So and as you'd expect, quite a large proportion of species that occur in the UAE ones that are sort of specialists of that sort of area. These are birds which are highly adapted to extreme temperatures and so on. Cosmopolitan is simply birds that occur over a very wide range, so in many different parts of the world. They're often seabirds actually, which can wander, which breed in all three oceans of the world. And there's also species whose ranges are concentrated in India and Malaysia, Indo-Malayan, and about 11% of the UAE's birds are fall into that category. There's just a couple of examples from several from there. Bridal tern is a seabird, cosmopolitan. It breeds across the Pacific and in subtropical and tropical islands in the Atlantic. Blue-cheeked bee-eater, which we saw a picture of just a little bit earlier, breeds mainly in Central Asia. It's on the southern edge of its breeding range here in the UAE and Oman. Indian roller, which we also saw earlier, as the name suggests, that's essentially an Indian species. It gets into Thailand and Burma as well, but essentially it's on the western edge of its range here in the UAE. And an interesting example of a Saharo-Scindian species, or desert species, is the eagle owl I've put down in the bottom right for you there, which breeds widely from Morocco to Arabia and a little bit further across. So they're just some examples of some of those categories there. There's the same numbers for the UAE in the bottom there, and comparable numbers for Arabia as a whole. And you'll see they're broadly similar, as you would expect. The only difference, of course, is that we have very few African species here in the UAE. There's just one species, a small dove, which actually colonized the UAE from about 1985 or 1988 onwards. It's now reasonably common in the desert. It doesn't really come into the cities very much. Whereas if in Arabia, of course, there's lots of African species in the southwest, in southern Saudi Arabia and Jazan. So that's why the yellow bar there for the UAE is much narrower. You'll also notice, however, that the blue bar at the end is a bit greater for the UAE because those are Indo-Malayan species. Indian species, as you'd expect, the UAE is on the eastern extremity of Arabia. It's likely to have some influence, or it's likely to have more Indian-centered birds than birds with an Indian-centered distribution than Arabia as a whole. So that's all that reflects. With regard to species of global conservation concern, I think I mentioned there's 27 in the UAE. Scientists have got essentially, you may have heard of it as referred to as a red list. It's maintained by the IUCN in Switzerland, but though for birds, it's the authority who deals with their BirdLife International. And about 27 species that occur in the UAE are on this global red list with different levels of categorization. One of them, sociable lapwing, is critically endangered. Another 5 are endangered, 7 are a little bit less threatened, they're vulnerable. And then we've got 14 other species which are nearly in the vulnerable category. They're described as near threatened. So the point here is the UAE has got a significant number of globally threatened species. It's an important place for those species. I don't want to talk, I'm not going to talk very much about conservation or anything like that, but I just wanted to point out we have also as recognised by the Ministry of Climate Change and the MOCCAE, they have categorised, or they have designated 30 important bird areas in the country, which total 420,000 hectares. Now, there's a difference between an important bird area and a protected area for birds, but I think that's about 4 or 5% of the UAE from what I remember. Just a few examples of some of those globally threatened species. All those birds in the background are Socotra cormorants. That's an extremely important species from an Arabian point of view. It only breeds in Arabia, and most of them don't breed in Socotra, although some do, which is an island off Yemen. Most of them breed actually in the Arabian Gulf. That's a very important species, which a significant proportion of the world's population actually breed on islands in the UAE in extremely dense colonies. Here's a couple more. Eastern imperial eagle, which comes from Kazakhstan, is endangered. It comes to spend the winter here. European turtle dove is a species, a Palearctic species, which occurs from Europe across to Central Asia, winters in Africa. It's declining rapidly in most of Europe. It's still actually doing quite well in the UAE. It breeds in plantations and so on in the desert. Sooty shearwater actually comes from New Zealand. Okay, it breeds in New Zealand. It spends the winter in the North Pacific and the North Atlantic, and small numbers come into the North Indian Ocean as well. They occur every year in the UAE off the East Coast. And finally, a shorebird there, great knot. This species breeds in northeast Russia and spends the winter mainly in Australia, but there's a small population that winter each year in the Arabian Gulf. I was going to stop there, but because Nick's in the audience, I thought I may as well just expand on this one slightly. The birds that we get here in the UAE, we know for sure that they come from the far east of their range, because we actually have a record of a bird with a band on it, which we were able to read in the field, and it had been banded in the Kamchatka Peninsula. It appeared in Quain in January 2019, and it was seen again. It was seen back again in Kamchatka the following August. And the guy who was banding those birds is funded by the received funding from the Mohammed bin Zayed Species Fund. So that's quite a nice. That was quite a nice story. With regard to those 28 or 27 protected species, that's the habitats that they typically use. There's a few, 8 I think, that occur in a mixture of habitats, or they're hard to categorise. The rest of them are a little bit easier to categorise. Sooty falcon, for example, are only on coastal islands. Just a couple of points about this, though. You'll see that anthropogenic habitats, human-created habitats, are actually really quite important. There's 4 different species, including sociable lapwing, which is the critically endangered one, which predominantly in the UAE relies on farmland and agricultural areas that weren't here 20, certainly not 50 years ago. There's also a significant number of species, which we'll come on to in a minute, which occur in intertidal areas. When we get to habitats, I'll talk about them a little bit more. There's 5 quite important species which require estuarine habitats. There's relatively few species which require fresh water, as you'd expect, because there's very little fresh water in the UAE. Those were species which are globally unusual. And of conservation concern, i.e. they're declining, but there's also a small number, maybe 12 or 15 further species, which, although they're not declining, they're particularly interesting when you come, that occur in the UAE, and they're particularly interesting to geeks like me. Things like Hypocoleus that we talked about earlier, and things like Hume's wheatear, which I've depicted just here. This picture I took on the railings at the Mercure Hotel in Jebel Hafid. This is a mountain bird in the UAE, but that on the map on the left, that's its world range. So if you want to see a Hume's wheatear, well, you've got to choose between Kurdistan, Iran, Afghanistan, northwest Pakistan, or the UAE or Oman. So this is a good example of a species which is much easier and safer to see here than pretty much any other country. I mean, some of those other countries are great places to visit, but you probably want to go there and come back before you tell your mom about visiting. At least that's what I did when I went to Iran, which I highly recommend. I want to move on now to habitats, so I'm just going to skim through, I think it's 7 or 8 different habitats in the UAE, just talk about them very briefly. We're going to start with natural habitats, and we'll finish with anthropogenic habitats just at the end, and I'm going to start with mountains and then move on to desert. This is Jebel Hafid, actually, and that's actually the Mercure Hotel just at the top there. So the mountains of the UAE, including Jebel Hafid, which is a little bit of an outlier, have a range of characteristic species. Hume's wheatear is one of them. This is another one, Persian wheatear, which is a winter visitor. Hume's wheatear is a breeding bird. But this species simply breeds in Iran, and it comes into Arabia for essentially just for the winter. This is another good example of a range-restricted species, which isn't threatened in any way, but it's of particular interest to visiting birdwatchers. This is a really good place, the best place to see it. You can often see it alongside Hume's wheatear, actually. Another bird which is typical of mountains, which inhabits acacia trees and so on, plantations in mountains, is this small, rather obscure species, plain leaf warbler. But again, if you want to see that breeding, you've got to go to Afghanistan. It's a winter visitor to the UAE. It's quite easy to find here. It's another particularly favoured species, or another particularly important species if you're a visiting birdwatcher, and it's a characteristic species of the mountains in winter. There are a small number of breeding species like desert lark and Hume's wheatear, but of course the UAE's climate is extreme, and the mountains in Iran and further north in Central Asia are actually much richer in breeding species, simply because they're not nearly as hot. So that's a little bit about mountains. I want to move on to deserts now, and first I'm going to talk briefly about the interior deserts, because you get slightly different range of species in the coastal deserts compared to in the interior deserts. This is a picture from Liba. And just a couple of characteristic species there. Greater hoopolark is a classic Saharo-Scindian species. It's a real bird of the deserts. Extremely highly well adapted to very, very arid conditions. It essentially doesn't need to drink. It spends the hottest part of the day, at least in some parts of Arabia, in holes, which it doesn't dig the holes, but it uses spiny-tailed lizard holes to shelter from the sun, and it essentially never leaves the desert. So that's an interesting example of a desert species. The next two, actually, which I'll just bring up together, because they often occur together, occur in similar habitats to the lark, but they're winter visitors. They both neither of them breed in the UAE. But again, like the lark, they've got a breeding range which stretches across the Sahara into northern India. And then in the case of both of them, actually, because they migrate, they also occur in the deserts of Mongolia as well. But they leave those deserts and come in winter in places like the UAE. So that's three characteristic species that are typical of desert environments in the country. The two on the right, actually, this is quite interesting. They actually often occur together. The wheatear is extremely conspicuous. It's easy to spot the wheatear. The warbler is a lot less easy to see. It's a lot duller. It's a bit smaller, and it doesn't actually it doesn't perch prominently like the wheatear does. But if you find a desert wheatear, it's always worth looking for the warbler as well, because the warbler often follows the wheatear, probably because the wheatear is good at spotting predators. But a good way to find desert warbler is to find desert wheatear first. Switching to coastal deserts, just briefly, these are three species which are very typical of coastal deserts, inland from Dubai, the Qudra area, for example, but don't seem to occur in the interior deserts. You won't see these sorts of things in Liwa and so on like that. Again, a couple of, on the top there, a couple of species highly adapted to the Sahara, as you'd expect, moving across to India, a lark on the left, black-crowned sparrowlark, and cream-coloured courser, which is actually a shorebird, but it doesn't really occur on the shore. It spends most of its time feeding in seizing insects and so on. Was that me? Don't know either. Okay, just one second. Bear with us. Yeah, maybe I hit something by mistake. Here we go. Okay, fine. Thank you. Sorry about that. I nearly said, where the hell's Bonnie there? The Nautica guys will know what I mean by that. Soon if you've got an IT problem, get hold of Bonnie. Yes, so anyway, back to these guys. So these are species which occur in coastal deserts. They tend not to occur in the interior desert. They all are resident in the UAE, but again, they all breed in the UAE, should I say. The lark on the left is resident. The courser is resident as well, but there's probably some of the ones that we see in winter are probably migrants from Iran and so on as well. The nightjar at the bottom left, I'll actually talk a little bit more about at the end. That's actually that's a migrant, but it's also a summer visitor. That's what the SV just remind me say. I'll mention that a little bit more at the end when we get to some recent discoveries and so on like that. So those are birds characteristic of coastal deserts. We're now on the coast itself. This is actually the view from Yas Links as you look across the mangroves towards Abu Dhabi Island, maybe Reem or something like that. So you've got mangroves, which I'll come on to in a second, and you've got lots and lots of intertidal mud, which is much more interesting than mangroves from a bird point of view. So just a couple of characteristic species there. Eurasian curlew is a migrant. It breeds in bogs and big wetlands in Russia and so on like that. It comes to the UAE as a winter visitor and as a passage migrant. It's near threatened. It's one of those five species that occur in intertidal mudflats, which are of serious conservation concern due to declining populations across its range, essentially. Crab plover, which you've also mentioned briefly and which will pop up again a little bit closer to the end. Again, that's another classic example of an intertidal bird in the UAE. And it's got quite a complicated status just there in red. Some are here all year. They breed in the UAE, but some also come from the winter from Iranian colonies, and some pass through on migration. It's a fairly complicated set of movements. Not everything that occurs in intertidal areas actually sits on the mud and sticks its beak into the mud, though that's what these things do. They take invertebrates from the mud. Of course, there's also some predators, so things like great spotted eagle. In the UAE, that's very characteristically a bird of mangroves, intertidal areas and mangroves. In its breeding range in Russia and so on, it's in forests alongside wetlands. But when it gets to Arabia, it concentrates in mangrove areas and to some extent in farming areas as well. But the classic place to see that is places like Ras Al Khor and mangroves. It's hard to believe, and I sometimes think the authorities in Abu Dhabi are doing quite a good job at insulating us from this. But actually, the UAE, Abu Dhabi Island, should I say, is surrounded by absolutely fantastic intertidal habitat on an enormous scale. And there's enormous numbers of birds if you could just get out to the mudflats of Fatesi or Balgelam to the north of Yas there, and even just Yas itself. It's really, really difficult to work out that you actually live in an amazing hotspot for shorebirds, but you do, and all these sorts of places, the sort of places that you can see on the map, they're absolutely fantastic places to go bird watching and look at lots and lots of shorebirds. This is a typical scene. You've got a bunch of crab plovers in the back there. You've got a great knot on the left-hand side. They occur in small numbers at a couple of places in the UAE. They're pretty uncommon. You've got Eurasian oystercatcher, the black and white ones, and you've got bar-tailed godwits in the middle. 3 of those birds are species of conservation concern. The oystercatcher and the godwit are near threatened. The knot, as I've mentioned already, is endangered, and the crab plover is just great birds. So, as a bird watcher or bird enthusiast, that's a fantastic spectacle to be able to just go out and see. And you can see the knot's a bit unusual, but you can see the other 3 very, very, and Caspian tern, which is the big white thing on the left there. You can see all of those very, very easily. Just a short hop from Abu Dhabi Island. I don't know if you can see. I can see on my screen, but you can't see on yours. And they're bar-tailed godwits and crab plover at the bottom there, taken on Balgelam Island. That's just north of Yas. And on my picture, I think the exposure is just a bit too bright there. You can see Reem Island in the background. So that's all I wanted to say about that. This is, they're very much local birds. The godwits are interesting. They fly here from the Arctic Ocean, where they breed. So that's a journey. That's a journey of, I guess it's 5,000-6,000 kilometers, flying across Russia essentially and Central Asia to pitch down in the Arabian Gulf. Some of them go on to East Africa and so on like that. That's quite an amazing migration. But actually, the same species, there's a population. This is one of my most favorite facts of bird migration of all. There's a population of bar-tailed godwits which breed in easternmost Russia and Alaska, and they winter in New Zealand. And in the autumn, they make a straight flight from Alaska to New Zealand. It takes them 8 or 10 days, and they do it non-stop. It's probably the most amazing migration feat that any bird does. The birds we get in the UAE have it easy. They just have to fly. 6,000 kilometers across land. They can stop almost any time they want, in theory. The birds that are flying from Alaska to New Zealand, if they stop in the ocean, they're dead. So it's really quite an amazing feat of endurance, as well as an amazing feat of navigation to be able to hit New Zealand from, I think it's 14,000 kilometers or 13,000 kilometers. Absolutely amazing migrants. Okay, I need to talk briefly about mangroves. Mangroves are absolutely wonderful places. They're just not really good for birds, at least not in this country. But they're fantastic habitats. They're full of fish and all the rest of it. But actually, for birds, they're not particularly characteristic here in Arabia. If you go to the Philippines or you go to Thailand, there's a number of species, which various kingfishers, sunbirds, which are real specialists of mangroves. In the UAE, that's not really the case, with just one exception on the left there, collared kingfisher, which is actually a very common bird from eastern India across to Indonesia. But in Arabia, it's extremely local, and it's only in mangroves. It doesn't actually occur in mangroves in the Arabian Gulf, but there is a population in Kalba on the east coast, which actually is an endemic subspecies. There's only about 55 to 60 pairs of it there. There's a few birds in Oman as well, but the main population is in Kalba, and that's strictly in mangroves. It requires old knotted mangroves for holes in old mangroves for nesting and so on. A much more common species that relies quite a lot on mangroves, it doesn't feed on mangroves, but it nests in mangroves, is western reef egret, which is a common bird all around the Arabian Gulf. You've probably seen them if you've been walking along the shore and things like that. Okay, this next bit's not about mangroves, it's about islands. And there's a couple of characteristic species of islands in the Gulf, white-cheeked terns and Saunders tern. These are both summer visitors to the Gulf. They come in the breeding season, which for these species is April to July or August, and then they leave and they spend the winter in the Indian Ocean. I'll come back to that in a minute with regard to Saunders tern. Those are species which are highly reliant on offshore islands, highly reliant on the lack of disturbance, the lack of predators, and the isolation that those islands, and that of course the isolation that those islands allow, and that of course makes them extremely vulnerable. Now everyone's got boats and there's easy access to all sorts of places. So these are species which are declining, probably, or likely to be declining, certainly in the colonies which are close to accessible areas. Off Abu Dhabi Island and so on like that. There's a little bit of data just to give you an indication of how islands in the UAE are really quite important from an Arabian point of view. The column on the right is the number of pairs of a number of different species in Arabia, and the data on the left is the best number, or the most recent number we've got for the number of pairs in the UAE. So for example, I think the one I wanted to mention briefly, well, I want to mention Socotra cormorant, a third from bottom there. Most of the, a very significant proportion of the Arabian population, which is almost essentially the world population, is in the UAE. That's a species that the UAE's got special significance for. There's a few other ones there. Sooty falcon is now extremely rare in the UAE. If you have any questions about that, just ask Umberto over there. He knows all about sooty falcons. And you'll also see crab plover, which I think we've mentioned a couple of times now, but there's two colonies in the UAE. One of them is relatively large, but nearly half the Arabia's population of crab plovers are nesting in the UAE. So it's a little bit of just a little bit of data for you there on that. I'm now going to move on briefly to anthropogenic habitats, in particular farms. This is the sort of thing that gets birdwatchers really excited when they see all those fantastic pivot fields on the left there, because those places are absolutely full of birds. Full of birds in winter, but also birds like collared pratincoll, which actually are now breeding in places like that. And there's a number of species. In fact, all these species, their distribution has changed, and their numbers in the UAE have changed increased dramatically, because of the provision of, because of the development of big, large-scale farming, like you can see just here. There's a relatively small number of farms like this in the UAE, but in Saudi, if you fly over Saudi and look out the window, most of northern Saudi is covered in farms like this. So, and that's had dramatic repercussions on the population of a number of species in Arabia. Species that are breeding there that weren't anywhere, were merely winter visitors, and rare winter visitors perhaps just a few decades ago. So those are all species which occur in the UAE in anthropogenic habitats. The kite, like the pratincoll, is essentially a recent colonist. It used to be a vagrant, but it's now breeding. It doesn't just rely on farms. It also occurs in golf courses. There's a pair or two on around Yas actually as well. I've mentioned briefly sociable lapwing, so I'll just talk a little bit more about that. That's the only bird that we regularly get in the UAE, or that isn't a vagrant to the UAE, that is critically endangered. It breeds in grasslands in Kazakhstan. They're all getting ploughed up. It migrates to Ethiopia. Some of them migrate to Ethiopia and Sudan. Another population, or the eastern population, migrate to northern India. But increasingly, they're spending the winter in Arabia now. It always occurred in Arabia as a rare bird, but we actually get more and more of them in the UAE now. I think last winter we had 80 or 90 different individuals of this species in 3 or 4 flocks in the UAE. When I started here 15 years ago, there was 2 or 3 each in a winter. So that's a nice example of a critically endangered species which is actually doing very well in the UAE. And presumably, because it's migrating a much shorter distance, it's probably surviving on migration. On average, it's surviving its migratory journey more. So the UAE is making a positive difference, or a positive help to the conservation of species like that. Wetlands are extremely rare in the UAE, obviously, but the ones that we do have, the few that we do have, are extremely rich, because if you put water in a dry place, the birds absolutely love that and they go absolutely crazy. This is Wathba Lake, which you can go and visit. It's only 30 kilometers from here, although don't go right now because it's currently closed for renovations. But it's a wonderful place to go and to look at birds. You can go there on a sort of nice morning in January or February, and you can probably find 60 species. Clamorous reed warbler is a typical breeding bird in the Phragmites reed beds in the back there. Marsh harrier is a common winter visitor. There's about 60 roosting, so there's about 60 that occur spending each night at Wathba right now in the winter. A few feed at Wathba, but many of them disperse out into the desert to feed over plantations in the desert. But they come back to the wetland to actually to spend the evening. It's a spectacular sight watching 40 or 50 of these big birds gliding around at sunset, coming in to roost. This rather unkempt-looking picture is actually to represent urban areas. I know it doesn't look like a typical urban area, unfortunately, but this is what Mushrif Palace Gardens in the middle of Abu Dhabi used to look like. And vegetation in urban areas, if the municipality leave it alone, which they generally don't. But if vegetation in urban areas actually grows an awful lot better than it does in the desert, it's watered, obviously. But the other problem there is in a lot of the desert of the UAE, that's totally overgrazed. So the desert of the UAE shouldn't really look like some of those pictures I showed you there. It should be lots of plants, but of course there's far too many camels, so there's very, very few plants. So urban areas where there's no grazing are good examples, or one of the few examples of where plants can really grow, and that actually benefits lots and lots of birds, because if you've got lots of thick cover, species can go and nest there. Some of those species are very common, like the silverbill on the left-hand side there. Some of the species are much less common, like the shikra on the right-hand side. The shikra is another good example of a bird which actually has really expanded its range in the UAE just in the last 10 years. It used to be essentially just restricted to Dubai, but it's now found all over the country, but in urban areas. It's found in parks and farms and so on in Al Ain, in Abu Dhabi, all over the northern UAE now, and it's even on some of the islands like Delma Island, and it's in Silla in the far west. Crested honey buzzard doesn't breed here, it comes in winter. But again, there's now plantations, there's therefore bees, there's much more food than there used to be. So they're examples of just urban birds that are birds that inhabit urban areas. Pallid swift I just put in, you may well have seen pallid swifts, they nest or heard them, they nest in some of the buildings in Abu Dhabi. They're interesting because they're actually a winter visitor to the UAE. They depart in April, May, we're really not sure where they go, and they come back again in September, October, and they actually come back to breed, so they're a winter breeder. Just there, they breed on ledges and buildings in different parts of the city. The other thing, of course, that parks and gardens are good for are migrants. This is Emirates Palace, and there's just a couple of nice migrants that stop off in places like this on their migratory journeys. I've given you a little bit of information about the range of each of those of species there. But urban areas are extremely important for birds like this. They essentially make the desert crossing, or the journey from East Africa to Kazakhstan or wherever you're going to breed, much more bearable. And these are great places, gardens and parks, if they're not too disturbed, are great places to look for exciting birds like this in migration, particularly in spring, also in autumn a little bit. So that brings us quite nicely to migration, which is the next thing I want to speak about. I've got a horrible picture here of a flamingo. But actually, I put it in deliberately because if you know, it's a flamingo in a field, in a puddle in a field. And why would it be there? Well, that's because the thing's lost and a bit tired and a bit fed up, and it just needs a break. You can probably feel that way yourself sometimes. So that's a greater flamingo in a farm in Dibba. The map on the left actually shows the routes of two different greater flamingos, which were tracked from Al Wathba Lake. This is some work that the Environment Agency did a number of years ago. And it just shows the interchange of these birds. You know, you don't tend to think of flamingos as migrating, but these birds travel thousands of kilometers. I was actually in Turkmenistan on the southeast side of the Caspian Sea there myself only a week ago with work, and we saw a load of Buick swans, which came from northernmost Siberia, Russia. We saw a load of hungry-looking white-tailed eagles, and we saw about 2,000 greater flamingos, all in the same place. So those birds really get around. What an amazing thing to think of such an ungainly bird like that traveling. I think there's actually been a greater flamingo which was banded in Italy or maybe southern France, which actually made it to the UAE as well. This sort of stylized sort of diagram just gives you an indication of sort of migration density in spring of birds through Arabia. And what you see, obviously, birds are nearly all the species that we have here, sort of 80 or 90%, or of the migrants that we have here are coming from Africa or spend the winter in Africa. So in spring, they're coming from Africa. There are a few that go to India, but most come from Africa, and most of them leave Africa, and most of them travel up the Red Sea, and they cross through the Levant there, through Lebanon and Israel and Palestine. Eastern Arabia is a little bit out on a limb, and we actually get a lot fewer migrants there. That's partly because most birds don't like a sea crossing. It's also because most birds don't really want to fly across the empty corridor unless they have to. That's a pretty arduous journey. So in the UAE, although we get lots and lots of migrants, and I'm going to show you a few things, show you a few of them in just a minute, they're much less, there's a lot less migrants than we get than you would see if you were in Egypt or in Western Arabia. A number of birds actively avoid the UAE, passing through the UAE on migration, and a good example of that are these two steppe eagles, which these were caught in winter in Arabia, and they were tracked to their breeding grounds back in Kazakhstan or southern Russia there. And you can see, although they moved through UAE airspace, they didn't cross the UAE. These are birds that they didn't cross the Gulf, in the UAE. They took the long way around via Kuwait. And these are birds which rely on thermals for migration. And there's no thermals over the sea, so they generally avoid sea crossings because it requires a lot more energy to fly over the sea. And there's a number of species which fall into the same category. A number of other raptors, storks, pelicans, which are all very characteristic of migration in Western Arabia. They avoid the UAE completely. But species like this, two wheatears, pied wheatear on the left and black-eared wheatear on the right, they don't worry about things like that because they don't soar. They're active flyers. And so the UAE is a great place to see things like this on spring migration. One of the great things about migration, particularly in spring, is it's completely unpredictable. That's a little bit of data. I haven't given you all the details. I didn't want to bore you completely. But that's a little bit of data from Lulu Island, which is a place I like to visit every so often. That was the 4th of March about 5 years ago. And then 6 days later, it was completely different. And you just never know what's going to, you just never know what's going to happen. Migration is extremely unpredictable. That's one of the things that makes it really, really exciting, and why people like me keep going out to find birds. You just never know what's around the corner. At the same time, migration in some ways is also stunningly predictable. These are some dates from 5 years. This is a little bit old, this data now, but it hasn't really changed. And this is the first date which I saw each species each year. And you'll see there's, within a few days, essentially, there's one or two exceptions for some of the scarcer species at the bottom there, lesser grey shrike, for example. But within a couple of days, each year, you can expect to see 1st of March, 28th of February, you can expect to see the first pied wheatear. Within the 5th, 6th, 7th of March, you can expect to see Turkestan shrike and so on. So migration at the same time has been completely unpredictable, and you just never know what's next. It's also comfortingly or reassuringly steady and regular. So that sort of thing. So that's a nice example of that. I'm just going to talk you through a couple of slides, just with examples of a few migrants which are typical of the UAE. This is a rather obscure little warbler called Minatries warbler, but again, this is another example of one of those birds that bird watchers really love, and that's because the UAE is one of the best places in the world to see it. That's a little bit of data on the left, months of the year, February and so on, up to May, and a little gap, and then September to November. And you can, it doesn't matter what the numbers on the left mean, but essentially you can see that this particular species, the vast majority of them in spring come through in March, for example. That's essentially what that shows. And then again, you can see the pattern for the autumn just there. Now that pattern is actually quite unusual. Most birds that migrate in the UAE are much commoner in one season than in the other. Generally commoner in spring, and common rock thrush is a good example of that. It's a little bit unusual in that actually its passage period is quite wide. You can see this species from the middle of February almost until the middle of May. But the point I want to make here is that it's extremely uncommon in autumn, and that's typical of a number of species. There's 1 or 2 species which are commoner in autumn, but there's 10 or 12 species which are much, much commoner in spring. And white-throated robin, which we saw a picture of just a little bit earlier, is a good example of that. This species and things like rock thrush have got what's called a loop migration, where they take a different route in each of the 2 seasons. So white-throated robin has a more easterly route in spring, so we get it in the UAE. It's pretty much unknown in autumn, because in autumn most of them move through central Arabia and down the mountains of Saudi Arabia, where it's actually extremely common. So that's an example of an interesting migrant. There's Gargany is just, I only threw that in as an example. That's quite unusual in that it's much commoner in autumn. It's actually quite unusual in spring, but we get big numbers from August. August isn't on that graph, but big numbers in end of August and then through September. So that's an example of a bird, an unusual example of a bird here, which is much more numerous in autumn. The reason I want to talk about northern wheat here is because after bar-tailed godwit, it's my second most favourite fact with regard to bird migration. It's much commoner in spring, as you can see there. It's a reasonably common bird in late March, early April. But the amazing thing about this is, or the thing that always blows me away when I see one of these, is if you see one in April or in the end of March, hopping around the golf course at Yas or wherever, in a bit of grass alongside a car park in Abu Dhabi, that bird could well be on its way to Alaska. We've got some data, I just took this off the web, but this species breeds from Canada right across Ireland, Iceland, Greenland, all the way through northern Russia to Alaska. And scientists have put geolocators, which are a bit like satellite tags, on birds in Alaska, and they've tracked them all the way to, and those geolocators have indicated that the population breed in Alaska actually winters in Kenya. That's a 15,000 kilometer flight, and it does it twice a year. So that's an amazing feat of, or that's an amazing sort of journey for a bird, which is about 25 grams long. The ones that breed in Canada actually cross the Atlantic Ocean. That's the only example of a passerine, a songbird, which actually routinely crosses the ocean on migration. The birds that breed in Canada end up in Senegal or West Africa. So it's quite an amazing feat of migration. Just before I leave migration and wrap up with a few recent discoveries, I just want to mention crab plover again. I said it's got quite a complicated quite a complicated status in the UAE. It breeds in 2 colonies, but also it comes here in the winter. It also migrates through the UAE, and this is just a little bit of data from the world distribution. There is on the left. It only breeds in Arabia where it's green, but it occurs reasonably commonly around the shores of the Indian Ocean. But a little bit of data from, this is a shorebird, which feeds on crabs and annelids in the mud and so on, as the name suggests. A little bit of satellite data from Masira Island, which is southeast Oman there, tracked 2 birds all the way back to Kuwait, which is where they were breeding. That was the track of one, fairly predictable, but the other one actually flew straight across the desert at night, which was something that you'd never have predicted a bird like that would actually do. It's a little bit longer to go the coastway, but it's a much more, you can stop regularly and have a meal and things like that. But that bird was obviously in a hurry and didn't do that. And that's a nice example of things that you could never really work out just by diurnal observations. That requires satellite tracking and so on like that. Okay, I said at the end, I said at the start, I just wanted to finish off with a few, a little bit of information about some recent developments and new discoveries. I wouldn't want you to think that we just go out and look at the same birds all the time. I also said I think that there'd been 470 species in the UAE. We've now added 2 more, and that was just in November. One in November, one in December. The sparrowhawk is not, on the left, is not too surprising. It breeds in Kazakhstan and winters in West Africa, or East Africa. So one drifting here on migration isn't so surprising. This ugly gull on the right-hand side, the biggest gull in the world, actually breeds in Ireland and across to Western Norway and Iceland. It's a rare bird in Turkey. There's the odd one has reached the Eastern Mediterranean. And 2 years ago, one turned up in Oman, and we thought that was interesting. And then it's probably the same bird which turned up in Dibba just last December. We're speculating it's the same bird because the one that turned up in Oman was 1 year old. This bird is 2 years old, so it seems too much of a coincidence there. So there's 2 species that have just been discovered or seen for the first time in the UAE. Now that's pretty trivial. There's a number of other important or interesting discoveries which are of much more interest. This bird is a breeding bird in the UAE. It's actually pretty common. In the mountains, well, we know of at least 10 pairs. There's probably dozens and dozens more. It was only discovered in 2017. It was completely unknown in the UAE until then. It's known from northern Oman, so it was likely, or it was possible, it was in the UAE. But as I say, nobody had found it until 2017. Just one or two final examples, and then I will shut up, I promise. Egyptian nightjar is a species I'm particularly interested in. I've done some work on Egyptian nightjars. It used to be regarded as a winter visitor and a migrant. This is a juvenile bird, and when someone produced a picture of a juvenile bird in 2013 in June, we thought that's got to be a chance that bird's breeding somewhere. But it took us 3 years to be absolutely sure. We found the eggs, and then we found the chicks. That's quite an amazing feat, and it wasn't achieved by me. But now we know that at one particular site, there's probably 10 pairs of Egyptian nightjar. Just last year, in July, we found 120 of these things roosting together in one site. They're certainly breeding at that place as well. Those two sites are about 50 kilometers apart. It's possible there's hundreds of pairs of this bird in the country just now. Another place where we've learned a lot of new things recently, or in the last decade, shall I say, are with regard to seabirds. Keen bird watchers have done dozens and dozens and dozens of trips off the east coast of the UAE, out of Fujairah, out of Kalba, since about 2010, and we've completely rewritten the status of about 8 or 9 different species. Juanen's petrel, which I mentioned at the start there, is one of them. Another example is this bird, flesh-footed shearwater. There were 2 records in the UAE up until 2010. It was known from Oman fairly commonly in the summer as a non-breeding visitor. This bird breeds in islands off Australia in December, so it migrates north in our summer. But we now know that if you take a boat out and you go out for 20 kilometres, you have a very good chance of seeing one in between, especially in May, June, and July and August. There's a little bit of data there, but I'm not going to worry too much about that. So we've learned an awful lot about seabird distribution in the UAE. These are 2 species which are particularly close to my heart because I spent quite a lot of time working on these. They're extremely similar. They genuinely are pretty similar. And for a very long time, we were really quite confused and we couldn't really tell them apart when they weren't in breeding plumage. These are in breeding plumage and there's a few minor differences. And if you'd asked me 3 years ago, I'd have said, well, little tern is pretty uncommon. We might get a few in winter. It definitely doesn't breed here. We knew that. Saunders tern is definitely a breeder. That's actually the case. And it's pretty common year round. That would have been our best guess. And that is completely incorrect. Because what we've now established in the last couple of years, the first thing is that they're not similar at all in breeding plumage. In non-breeding plumage. You can see there, anybody could tell those apart. That's extremely straightforward. And the reason we didn't know what Saunders tern looked like is because none of them are here in the winter. Saunders tern actually winters on small islands in the Seychelles and the Maldives. That's where they're all going for the winter. Little tern is extremely common. Actually, all the birds we get here in the winter are little terns, and there's a few hanging on. They don't breed, but there's a few hanging on in the summer as well. So that's an example of 2 species that aren't really even similar to one another, that we've only just worked out in the last couple of years. That's an example of work that was carried out partly in the UAE. I was involved in a bit with a colleague from Ireland, but that's had repercussions all around the Indian Ocean because everyone in Oman and Saudi Arabia and Kenya and Tanzania, they all thought they had Saunders tern in the winter as well, and it's completely incorrect. They're all little terns. If you want to see Saunders tern in the winter, go to Bird Island in the Seychelles. I'm just about to shut up. I've no idea what time it is, but I think it should have been possibly quite some time ago. I'm just about to shut up, but just a couple of things to say. If you'd like a little bit more information about one or two of the things I've said, there's a couple of nice websites there. UAEbirding.com is obviously a local one run by Tommy Pedersen, a good friend of mine. Tom is going to talk about eBird in just a second, so I won't say any more about that. This is a great book on the left, and some of the figures and graphics which I've used today have come from that book. It's freely available online. It's a wonderful resource and extremely well written. And I also have to mention the one on the right as well, which is due out in March 2024. Just a few thanks just there. Thank you to everyone at Nautica who've put up with me for the last year. A few of my friends who I've done some bird watching with, and Mark in particular did the graphics for some of the slides, for some of the graphs and so on there, which ended up in the book. And a few other people. I have to mention Martin. I thought Martin would be here tonight. Some of those pictures were taken off Martin's boat on various trips with Claudia and other people. And also to Gilly and Daisy as well. Gilly's here tonight, but we didn't bring Daisy because she's a cat. Thought all the smells at SeaWorld might get her a bit excited. That's the slide I usually finish on, but actually that's actually not quite correct because it's over to Tom. I apologize if I've completely overrun.
Well, yeah, amazing. Thank you so much. And I'm sure we have a lot of questions coming up. But yes, I just wanted to introduce Thomas Funke just now, who is our senior education manager, and especially looking at the center, and is actually a very, very keen birder. And so he's going to come here on stage to just let you know a bit more about how to use one of the tools that we just spoke about to go out there and look for birds, because now we know that there are a lot of birds to look for. Just a quick introduction of Thomas. Thomas is coming from southwest Michigan, where he spent a lot of time in the forest and in the wetlands looking at birds from his young age. He worked for the Audubon Society in Michigan for over 20 years. And he's been involved in many citizen science initiatives, and is exactly what he's developing here with the center. And we are very glad to have him coming on stage and talking about birding.
Thank you. Yeah, that's one thing that I've been involved in for a long time is citizen science. So I've been involved in a lot of citizen science from basically starting out with prototypes, and they'd hand me the stuff and I'd go out and I'd try it. So I've been really involved in that for years. And my favorite citizen science program, and let's see if we can still be there. Hold on, there we go, is eBird. So Oscar showed all these wonderful graphs and all these maps and all these numbers, and you're probably going, where in the world does all that information come from? Well, for hundreds of years, it came from professional ornithologists like John James Audubon. I'll name one from my neck of the woods, and his name is Larry Walkinshaw, who is a crane expert. So these scientists and citizen scientists back in the day collected this information, and it's published, and we now have a lot of government agencies that collect stuff. But recently, it's really been folks like yourselves collecting data and getting it into a database. And eBird is the database where anybody who can identify a bird can put this right into a database right online. So there's a web portal, and if you're really like, wow, I want to do this, start with a web portal. There is an app, but you really want to know how this works when you start. So you get a biography and all that good stuff. Don't be impressed by that number 885, because I think Oscar has a few more than me. So it keeps track of your birds. I started off just like going out and identifying birds and writing them down, and then I got to the point where when this came out, I'm like, wow, this is really neat. And this is a great way to not only track your own birds, but contribute data to a database. So, I mean, this is really simple. You tell it basically, where am I birding? And there's actually, in the database, SeaWorld Abu Dhabi. And if you go in there, you'll probably see my name a bunch, because I've been collecting data on the birds I see right here on property, and I put it in here. See a lot of bulbuls. I see an occasional roller, but you just tell it where you are. You basically tell you what day, what time, how you did it. So when you go in here, you click on the more info to learn a little bit more what these mean. I'm not going to go over here. But, the date, the time, how many people you were with. And if you ask my son who we walked here today, I was identifying all the birds as we walked here. I actually have what is called a transect, which is basically a line I walk and identify the birds. I do one almost every morning when I walk here to work. And it's got a real fancy name to it. It's called the Water's Edge to Morale Transect. It's really exciting. Yeah, because I used to walk all the way down to the morale offices, which is another kilometer from here. So you tell it how you're birding, you're telling it where you're birding, the time. No, don't do that. Oh, it's because it's been a while since I put my numbers in here. You find the birds that you saw, how many you saw, you put it in here, and then you go over here, you tell it, are you completing a checklist of the birds you were able to identify? So if you're sitting at your kitchen table and you see 5 different birds, you know what they are, that's great. Put them in here. If you don't know what they are, that's fine too. Don't worry about it. And as you go along with birding, it's a pretty simple activity. You saw the books up there. There's also a Birds of the United Arab Emirates, pair of binoculars. You don't even need binoculars. When I do my walk every morning to work, I don't use binoculars. And I put in eBird every morning that I walk here, what I see. So very simple. You click submit, and in it goes. There you go. I'm glad that did that because I didn't want it to go in and delete a checklist. So I'm glad it did that. And then the data goes into the database. And this data is accessible to scientists. It's accessible if you want to go in there and download and do your own little study. It's accessible. And it goes into some global databases as well, so others across the planet are able to access this data. And it's coming from, everyday people who like to watch birds. It is important for me to mention, too, this information is vetted. So if you put something crazy in there, like osprey, saw an osprey. I'm from North America. They're everywhere. Are you sure you saw an osprey? I'm like, yeah, well, apparently there's very few ospreys around here, but it was definitely an osprey. I saw it out at Jubail Wetlands. So, there'll be folks that check on you. Now, here in the United Arab Emirates, you have folks like Oscar, myself. You got some serious bird watchers going on. And United Arab Emirates, we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of data we can collect. I just want you to look at, Oscar mentioned, what was your number? 472. So 479, don't believe everything you read, because there's like an official 472 and then there's like an unofficial 479. That's probably the best way of putting it. But I want you to look at this number, 48,000 complete checklists. Remember that number, 48,000 complete checklists. Maybe even how many eBirders? 2,509. I bet you most of those are folks coming here. They're tourists, right? And looking at stuff. 1,559 hotspots. Those are, like Oscar mentioned, the pivot fields. You mentioned a couple parks. The Yas Links Golf Course. That's a great place to go bird watching. In fact, that's the first place I saw Eurasian curlew. I was like, oh my God, on a golf course. Who would think, right? So just remember these numbers. So United Arab Emirates is about the same size of South Carolina, which is a state in the United States. Look at that, 695,000 checklists to our 48,000. We have a lot of work to do. So that's why I encourage folks to sign up for eBird. They have, I think that's that number, what's the number? They have 862, and we have over 1,000, right? So a lot of our hotspots are small little parks. The eBird crew that watches the website are very good at adding it hotspots, but the number I look at is how many checklists. How many checklists? I like to pride myself in having a lot of checklists. Not so many species, I'm okay with my numbers, but I really like to know that I am contributing to this database by adding checklists. And then here's my osprey map. So when you go in here, you can actually explore. You enter your species. You can pull up a map. It's like, wow, all these birds he was mentioning, and where they are. You go in here and it shows you. And where it's red, these red balloons, these are recent sightings. And you click on it, see what happens. Oh my gosh, there's my name. And this website likes to lock up. on occasion because it's been sitting there for a while. There you go. So it tells you, I saw at my apartment complex flying down the canal an osprey. It's like, oh, I was very excited because apparently they're pretty uncommon here. So I see them a lot back home. So you can go in here and move, enter any bird you want, and it will show you where these birds live. It shows you who has seen them. If you wanted to gamify this and have a little competition, it's easy to do. You just put your information in here. So this is a great database. I really encourage you to sign up. And if you did this once a month, look at all the people in here, once a month, and times that by 12, that's probably 1,200 checklists. That's like 3% of what's already in there, just the people in this room. So ebird.org, wonderful website, wonderful way of collecting data. It's fun. There's a ton of information on here. Highly encourage you to check it out. And then once you get some birding under your belt, check out the app. And the app just helps you speed up putting data in there. So there you go, eBird. Sign up. Thank you very much.
So you were saying that some birds were recently spotted. I was wondering if the reason why they were recently spotted was because they had to change their migration patterns, or habitats in general had to change.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. I think you're referring to maybe one of the last slides there, that gull and the thing. So they're vagrants. They don't normally occur in the UAE. They're well off track. The gull maybe flew too far in the winter, and the sparrowhawk, the Levant sparrowhawk, drifted a bit further east off its normal migration route. Now that happens because of weather. It happens because of faulty genes or a storm or various things like that. So that's just random chance, really. But there's lots of examples there of birds that definitely have changed their distribution because of habitat and the availability of new habitats. Of course, at the same time, there's also some birds in the UAE which have lost habitat, and they're less common than they would have been 50 years ago because of development and loss of intertidal areas and so on like that. And there's also examples of birds which are changing their migration routes because of habitat. For example, I think I had a picture of steppe eagles there. Steppe eagle used to migrate through Arabia and go to West Africa, where there was lots of food. But now in Arabia, because there's those big farms, and there's also lots of dumps where they're putting out offal and meat and so on like that. Steppe eagle is much commoner now in Arabia as a winter visitor than it is in Kenya, for example. So that's an example of a bird which has a significant proportion of the world's population has shortened its migration route in response to changing habitats. Yeah, I think you mentioned climate change. I didn't quite hear all the question, I'm afraid, but there are lots and lots of examples. I probably won't go into now, but there's definitely lots of examples of where birds, their range is changing, their wintering range and their breeding range is changing in response to climate change. There's lots of examples of that too. Did that answer the question?
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
All right. What kinds of urban species have been observed in the rapidly growing cities like Abu Dhabi and Dubai?
Sure, you go ahead. I'll go follow.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, well, some of the species I showed there, so you've had white-cheeked bulbul is a very good example. That's mainly, well, actually, that's not strictly urban, but it's certainly very common, very numerous in urban areas, but that's actually now spread into, you can see that in wadis in the mountains, and you can see that in small oases and bushes and things, petrol stations along the main roads and so on like that, away from vegetation. So that's maybe one example, but things like red-wattled lapwing, for example, they're much commoner in urban areas than they are anywhere else, despite the fact that they nest on the ground, and there's obviously a lot more rats and predators and so on in urban areas. Clearly, the advantages of living in urban areas where there's a lot of there's water, for example, and there's also presumably a lot more food, outweigh the disadvantages of much higher nest failure, I guess. So that would be another example. I think of the 20, I think I said there was 25 sites which have recorded about 200 species in the UAE. Most of them are not urban, not particularly urban, but nearly all of them are anthropogenic in the sense that they're farms often, because you get a variety of habitats around farms. There's often wet areas where they're disposing of the water and bushes growing up around the side and so on like that. However, I guess you could argue if you look at Abu Dhabi Island as a whole, that's pretty much almost all urban, and there's been 300 species, for example, approximately 300 species recorded there. So lots and lots, I think.
One cool thing you can do with the eBird is you can go in there and have a calendar, tell it what years, and you can watch the map change over time. You just keep changing the years, and you can see birds moving. You can also see them increasing in density or lessening in density, because with climate change, you get a lot of these, where I'm from, a lot of southern birds moving slowly north as the climate warms. And you can just sit there and watch it on the eBird as you put more data in there and more data to work with. So, in questions like that, you can use this tool, and you can learn a ton just by doing that.
Yeah, just to follow on from that, yeah, that's a very good point, actually. Although eBird's only been running for about 10 or 12 years, I think, a lot of people now have gone back through their notebooks and put in loads and loads of historical data. So yes, you can see changes in bird distribution just by going to the Explore button and messing around a little bit with the maps. And just to follow on from one thing, because eBird is absolutely fantastic. I was very, very slow to, I've done a lot of bird watching, I was very, very slow to start using it, but I started in, I think, 2018, and within a week, I was like, why the hell have I not been doing this for the past 40 years? But just to follow up from what you were saying there, and a couple of other good points is you mentioned putting your name to it and so on like that. If you don't want everyone to know that you're a bit of a geek, you can actually do it anonymously. You don't have to put your name there. So don't be put off by that. But the other thing to say is it's actually, if you see something which isn't very likely, which if you're just starting, you probably didn't see that, you're probably wrong, it actually will tell you that. So it's actually a really good way to learn. Because if you put in that you've seen something which doesn't occur at that time of year, or doesn't occur in the UAE or something, you'll have to justify it. And that's a clear indication that you're perhaps incorrect. And you can also, if you go into the database and mess around a little bit, you can see how likely it is that it was here on such and such a date and things like that. So it's actually a really good way of learning, because it helps you filter out lots and lots of the mistakes.
Especially if you're new, like I'm new here, and I put in there something like a tawny pipit, right? Red flags go off. Am I really looking at this bird? And I go back and I look at my books. I go and look at some photos, and no, it was really, the water pipit that's very common here. And they look pretty close when you look at them. So yeah, it's a great tool.
Great. Thank you. Question. Oh, there. Yes.
Hi, my name is Coco, and I have a doubt with a range-restricted species that you said, a Hume's wheatear, and you said the species were declining. I wanted to ask if there are any conservations that are going on for these specific birds or any of these range-restricted birds.
Me again, I think, is it?
Go ahead,
okay. Yeah, first thing to say is I hope I didn't say Hume's wheatear is declining, because I didn't mean to say that. If I did, we've no evidence of that. That's an example of a bird which has probably always had a fairly small range. Range restricted doesn't tell you anything about is it common or is it rare. It just means it's got its relatively restricted distribution in terms of the sort of surface of the planet. That's all that means. In the UAE, Hume's wheatear is pretty common in the right habitat, which is mountains and the gravel plains very close to the mountains. It is possibly threatened there a little bit by things like quarrying, which is a big hobby of people in Fujairah. So these big industrial quarries are probably not very good for it, but otherwise it's not really there's no evidence that it's declining at all, and therefore there's definitely no conservation action for that. I don't even think its population has actually been monitored, which I guess means we wouldn't know if it was declining, but there's no evidence that it's declining. But for other species which are declining in the UAE, there definitely is some conservation action being taken. Some people would say not enough in some cases, but there is definitely conservation action being taken. The Environment Agency have monitoring programs for things like Socotra cormorants and sooty falcons and so on like that. And of course, monitoring is the first thing that you need to do to work out if things are declining or not. Then you can declare protected areas and stop people from hunting and so on like that, or whatever. Or you can factor in decisions about, are you going to develop this area of mudflat or not, if you know which species of shorebird use it and so on like that. So yes, there are in the UAE for sure there are conservation actions which are being taken targeted at a relatively small number probably of specific species, for sure. Yeah, but there's also still quite a lot of species which are declining in the country as well. I tried not to talk about them too much because I didn't want to get you too depressed. But
and actually, sorry, thank you. Just to follow up on that, is there any regional effort, like conservation effort on birds? Any regional program, meaning the Arabian Peninsula or even including the country on the north of the Arabian Gulf?
Yes, I'm not an expert in that sort of area, but there are. Certainly there's a number of publications that look at the distribution and the status of birds in the Arabian Peninsula as a whole, for sure. There are definitely programs. Umberto actually would know a little bit more about this than me, but there are certainly programs that take the global or the regional perspective for things like Egyptian vulture and sooty falcon and things like that, where experts from the UAE and other countries sit down every couple of years and try and plan out what they're going to do to protect this species and that species and so on, because there's no point in protecting it in the UAE if it's in trouble in Oman, if it's not being looked after in Oman and so on, and coordinate efforts and influence governments and so on like that. So that certainly is going on for a number of species. Yeah.
All right. Thank
Is
you.
that correct, Umberto?
All right.
Good.
We had a question here. Yeah. Just yeah. Raise your hand again. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you tell some interesting stories about how you were chasing birds around the world, or have you?
This is a nice one. Nice.
Is this for me?
Yes, I guess so.
Yeah, I can tell. Well, I've already told one. I told you the one about not telling my mom until I came back from Iran. I can tell you one or two, but there's a person over there who knows a few more because she's been with me on some of them. But one or two of them are quite embarrassing. That's a really difficult question. It's a good question, but it's a very difficult question. We can tell you one or two stories. Yes, I'll give you just one example. Yes, I was walking through the desert in Western Arabia at some point. Well, okay, it was in Israel, quite close to the Egyptian border. I saw a sign way up ahead of me, and I didn't really worry too much about it. I just kept walking. I was with a couple of friends, actually, wandering around a little bit, and I had to stop with my telescope and bits and pieces like that. I got a bit further on, and we just kept going. About an hour later, we actually sort of came back round, and we could read the sign. So we sort of crossed, and we come back round, and we're now looking at the sign, and the car was about 2 kilometers back on the other side of the sign, and the sign said, "Danger, minefield." So that's one example that springs to mind. There's a number of other ones, but maybe wait for the autobiography.
All right. We had just a question just here. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm gonna come to that side after. Just one question in the middle. Yes, just here. I wait for the.
Thank you. Actually, we came for this talk because we're really amateur bird watchers back home, and we recently moved to UAE. I was interested in knowing, are there any groups or are there any places where we can go watch birds just like that, or any group which we can join which routinely goes and we can join them?
Let me tell a story.
Yeah.
I was in your same position 2.5 years ago, and I was trying to find a local Audubon chapter here. Audubon is in North America. There isn't an Audubon. I found the Emirates Natural History Club, and I reached out to Claudia, and she was super excited. And tell her about the first trip we took. Well, the three of us.
So I went this time to Wetland.
Turn it on.
Oops. There you go.
Yeah, so, and he was constantly filming and watching the birds and sending all the information to the US. So this was really super excited. And let's say, thanks to Oscar, I have learned a lot about birds. So we do usually birding trips with the Natural History Group. But our main spot is the Al-Wahba wetland, where I'm myself pretty active. But unfortunately, the wetland is currently closed. It will reopen in the next winter season. And you can put your name down or give your name to Tony, and we will put you on the list of the Natural History Group or WhatsApp group. And once the reserve is open again, we will also do trips with Oscar there again, and I will join as well. It's always good when we have a couple of people that know some birds, because, you know, when there's one bird sitting and 40 people are coming, the bird will fly away. So I prefer always to do any kind of nature observation just with small groups, with a couple of people that can distribute. Otherwise, no one will benefit from it, and also the birds not. And otherwise, I know when you are keen, we can also put you on our WhatsApp group, because there are sometimes some small groups, for example, Tom and Mata, they go out and check for some birds, and there's always someone welcome. So when you say, okay, when you ask in our group, is someone out for birding, could I join? Then it's fine. But bird watching generally, to my opinion, should be done just with a few amount of people, because otherwise it makes no sense. And yeah, the first thing to do it here, go to the garden areas where you can find many birds. For example, take this Birds of the UAE book with you, and a small binocular, not too big, otherwise you will get a problem with a big camera. You also are not welcome in the parks. But for example, when you go to Al Emirate Park, if you are a bit lucky, you see even big birds like the honey buzzards also sitting there. We had records of nightjars in buildings in the city. So I think now is a good time to look at birds and just get the book. Yeah, maybe wait till March when the new one is out, and with the book and some binoculars, go through the parks, the mangroves, and you will find a lot by yourself, and we can add you to our group. You are most welcome.
Nice. Yeah, I would recommend joining the group as well. All right, question here.
Hear me? Okay. You were talking about the critical threat for the birds to the near threat. Like, what is the difference with the pairs? Like, how many pairs does it have to drop to in order for it to be considered critically a threat?
Yeah, Oscar, go ahead.
Okay, that's slightly outside my field of specialism as well. I think what you refer to is, I think I mentioned critically endangered, and then vulnerable, and then near threatened. Yeah, yeah. There's those categories are a couple of things to say. That for each species, they are reviewed on maybe a 5-yearly basis or 3-yearly basis. They're reviewed in discussion with a number of experts, coordinated by BirdLife International. And there are definite criteria that are used to assign a species into one category or not. So, and the sort of criteria that are used are perhaps extent of world range, for example, number of known population, if known, evidence. You may not have evidence of decline in the across the entire range. You may not have enough data to judge that. But is the species declining in? Is the species declining in 3 or 4 areas which are well spread out across the range? That would be good evidence of a decline across the whole range. But then, of course, not only do you need to think about is it declining, you then need to think about how rapidly is it declining. And there's criteria that they use. It's something like maybe, again, Umberto would maybe know a little bit more about this, but it's something like perhaps a 20% decline or a 40% decline in, I think what they use generations, don't they? 3 generations, yeah. So, so for some of these birds, a generation is what, 3 years, 4 years, something like that. So there is definitely a numerical way of assigning, there's a number of criteria, and if a bird ticks enough of these boxes, it'll go into one of them, and if it ticks different criteria, it'll go into another one. If it doesn't tick any of the criteria, there's another category which I didn't mention, which is least concern, i.e. it's not known to be severely declining. And then there's a final category which is actually data deficient. So for a small number of species, we just don't have enough data to be able to say. But those categorizations are reasonably robust. There's definite criteria that are applied. The problem is you may not always have enough data to absolutely be certain that you can see it's a bit of guesswork in some cases. Does that answer that? Is that, yeah?
Yeah, those are described, those on redlist.org. You can go right in there and it shows you exactly what he's talking about. Yeah, it describes it perfectly. So redlist.org is a great resource. And somebody also asked about conservation programs for animals. That also is on, if you look at the species page, there's a list of conservation programs that are taking place. So that's another great resource, redlist.org.
Yeah, just one thing for any bird stuff, if you go to BirdLife Data Zone and you put the species in, so BirdLife Data Zone Humes wheat here, you'll get the full discussion. You'll get 600 or 800 words perhaps. On Humes wheat here, you might only get 400 because it's least concern. But if you go to sociable lapwing, you will get 2,000 words on sociable lapwing and all the references that have been used to make the decision to make it critically endangered and not endangered, for example. So it's all completely transparent. But yeah.
Thanks. Andres? Yes. And we might end the session. Yeah.
Okay, this question is for both of you. I know that the Hubara is an emblematic species besides the falcon here in the UAE. In both presentations that you've been discussing about threatened species, conservations, and I guess you have heard about RENECO. This is a facility, a laboratory that's working on the conservation of the Hubara. Last year, we visited facilities of the RENECO laboratory. We were very impressed of the resources that they have on the genetic laboratory. So my question basically is there any other example of such conservation or program of efforts for any other bird species or endangered species you have seen in your experience?
I'll go. Yeah, I'm sorry, I was struggling to follow the whole question there. I think you started by asking about Hubaras. Hubara busters.
Yes. So to have, is there any other example of species with such a intensive, I guess, conservation program?
I mean, Hubara is a little bit exceptional because there's extremely intense conservation efforts for Hubara because it's such an emblematic species in the Gulf states, and because wealthy people in the Gulf are prepared to pour money into something like that. And yes, there are facilities in the UAE, but also part of the same operation, there are facilities in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and so on, and Morocco and Jordan, where hubara are being bred for release. Now, there's various issues associated with that, and conservation breeding like that has to be done properly, has to be done extremely carefully, because it's very easy for the birds to become habituated, and they're not, you can release them and let them go, but they still come back for a feed and things like this. They're not really behaving like wild birds. I mean, there are many other examples. I don't know if there's any from the UAE, well, falcons perhaps, but that's a different story. There are many other examples. Are there a number of other examples in other parts of the world, for sure? For example, some rare, very isolated populations of species in the Seychelles, for example, which maybe occur on one or two islands. They have been intensively captive bred and then released, and for example, they've gone extinct on one island because rats were introduced there. They've then bred them in captivity and then released them back onto the island, and they now occur. Those species are now on that island. They're common. The island might only be 3 kilometers long or less, but they're now common there, for example. So that's an example of conservation breeding from the Seychelles. And there's other islands. There's stories from Mauritius and bits and pieces like that as well. There are also examples from bigger countries. I'm more familiar with the UK than other places. And the great bustard, for example, which traditionally, historically occurred in the UK, but went extinct a good 200, 300 years ago. It's a species of serious conservation concern. It's crashing across. It's going to be extinct all over the world, apart from in Spain, probably in the next 15, 20 years. But it's now been released. It's been reintroduced, I should say, from captive bred birds in the UK, for example. So, and that will actually make a real difference to the species conservation species conservation prospects, I guess, to establish another population there. There are various other examples of birds of prey, in particular, which are now being reintroduced right across Europe. Actually, reintroduction and rewilding is a big business now in lots of parts of the world, actually, and that them repairing the habitat or letting the habitat repair itself, and then reintroducing the things that have gone extinct. They're typically big predators like white-tailed eagles in the UK, or wolves, for example, or stuff like that. And that's big business in various parts of the world. I can't think of many other examples from here, however, apart from hubara, which you brought up.
Thank you. All right. It's 8. Do you want one more question? One last? And we had one over there. Okay, in the middle. And that will be the last one. Yeah.
Hi, I will not ask a question to Oscar today, at least. But anyway, I have a question for you, Thomas. I started using eBird nowadays. So the problem which I face today, as I think you mentioned before, if you don't know the birds, that's not a problem. But some of the time, eBirds helps us to identify the birds as well. When you select the birds in the checklist and it doesn't appear on the checklist because it's not found on that place or region. So it gives you an option to add your species. At that time, it also asks you for add details, description, and add media. Just my question is, if we add a photo of the bird which we have identified, then how we will know is it the correct bird which we...
So eBird has what are called reviewers.
Yeah.
So I'll admit, adding a bird to a species list is a very dangerous thing to do. So there's also so you have a reviewer, they're going to look at it, they're going to ask questions, they're going to email you to justify what you've seen. There's another application called Merlin. I don't know if you're familiar with Merlin, but Merlin's a phone app where you can take a picture and it will sometimes identify it correctly, and you can actually record the voice. That's a little bit more accurate. Those are just tools. They're not the end-all be-all. Don't trust these things 100%. It comes with time, comes with going out, looking at the books and things like that. But yeah, it will be reviewed. If you're adding a species, it's going to go to a reviewer. A lot of times you'll see a bar come up. Like I put like one day like 3 tawny pipits, and it's like, oh, that's too many. I'm like, I know you're laughing. So I'm like, okay. And somebody will email you, or you'll justify it there, and they'll read your justification. If you're a regular e-birder like Oscar is, and he says he saw a Namakwa dove, they're probably not going to question him. I'm new to the area, so I get questioned every once in a while, and I have to justify it. So just keep that in mind. You're going to put a photo in. There's a reviewer. Use some of these other tools. The bird book, Merlin is another. It's actually Merlin's pretty good because I'll listen to the calls and I'll look at the birds. I don't really use the photo or the recording the audio, but the photos and the descriptions are actually very good in Merlin.
Yeah, I think at the moment I have already my reviewer.
Yeah, okay.
I just want to make a final comment. So as here are many people, maybe you find a bird in need, and I would ask you to contact the SeaWorld rescue team, because we had a couple, we could save with people that were aware of birds in need. We could already save 2 birds. The third one, unfortunately not. So, and one was a spotted crake that someone found. It was released back to the wild in a good condition. It's living now in the Al-Wakhba wetland. And then we had a gull. It was, which gull was it?
Caspian.
Caspian
gull that actually my husband found with a broken wing. And it was really rescued and treated so well that it could be released back to the wild. For an osprey that we collected, we could not help it because its kidneys were gone. It was in such a bad condition that the help was too late. But please don't close your eyes. Contact the rescue team, and often these birds will have, they can go back to the wild, or at least support science why they passed away. So, and with this also thank you to the rescue team and also to Tom. They all supported this, and I hope you all will continue supporting this. Thank you.
Well, yeah. Thanks, Claudia. And for next talk, I'll put the number on the back of the. I have the number if anyone wants to put it in his number. The number for the rescue line of the SeaWorld Research and Rescue team. Thank you so much, Oscar. This was amazing. Yeah, amazing. You're just like. A book, just a walking book. It's amazing. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, Thomas. And thank you, everyone, for coming. This was the first session of 2024. A lot more to come. See you soon.